So welcome to this webinar on home energy injustices, which is hosted by the Energy Demand Research Centre. I'm Sarah Higginson, and I'm the Impact and Engagement Manager at EDRC, and I'll be chairing the session today. EDRC stands for the Energy Demand Research Centre, and our research is focused on creating an affordable and secure low-energy future. We have a 5-year research consortium, which we're almost halfway through, and we have over 90 researchers in more than 14 universities growing all the time, because we have a flexible fund, which is open and is worth £1.9 million. We're funded by EPSRC and ESRC, and we have 5 themes, and you can see that there are links to them here: place, flexibility, governance, futures, and equity. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see our link to our website and to our social media campaigns, and also a way to sign up to our newsletter. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So I'm very happy to say that this webinar is also marks the launch of our first campaign, and this is the Energy Equity campaign. It's the first of a series of campaigns at EDRC, and the aim of these is to focus on a set of key messages based on empirical evidence derived from EDRC research, to create a community of researchers within EDRC and beyond, and to provide a focus for stakeholder engagement to amplify our messages and maximize the possibility of focused impact. So please do get in touch with us if you're interested in energy equity, and you can do this either through our social media platforms or by emailing me on the email address that will be at the end of the slides. By focusing on energy equity, EDRC recognizes the historic and systemic injustices created by the energy system and the need to address these as our energy system evolves to become more decarbonized, digitalized, and more flexible. Only by doing this can we hope to make our research relevant to the central concerns of everyday people. We will be examining each of our key messages in detail through a series of events and via social media platforms, as I've said, in the coming weeks and months. But today we have pleasure in presenting our high-level messages, which are based on empirical evidence, as I said. And these are that targets are important but not sufficient, that language, definitions, and metrics matter, and we'll be examining that in quite a lot of detail today, that the evolving energy system must have equity at its heart, and that by focusing on the underserved by the energy system, we can achieve multiple benefits, that home energy advice provides critical support to people, and that wider long-term economic benefits are possible if energy demand reduction policies are carefully designed and aligned. Over the coming months, we'll run a series of events on energy equity around these key messages, and we urge you to look out for those and try and come to them when you can. So let's get on with the webinar, which is why you're here after all. If you can start sharing your slides, Stefan, while you're doing that, just to let you know that if you want to ask any questions, you can put these in the Q&A. If possible, you might want to signal who you would like to answer your questions, although other people might also chip in. I'd ask that you refrain from using the chat unless you have technical issues and need help. So Stefan, I'm just going to introduce you first. Professor Stefan Buraszewski is the Professor of Human Geography at the University of Manchester, and here he leads the People and Energy Collaborative and serves as a Manchester Energy Ambassador. His research focuses on urban social inequalities, low carbon transitions, and the political ecologies of just transitions. He has published extensively in this area, and his work with organizations such as the World Bank, the United Nations, the International Energy Agency, the UK government, and the EU has earned him honors, including being named an ordinary hero in the EU the EU Protects campaign. Over to you, Stefan.
Thank you, Sarah. I hope everyone can see me and hear me and can see my slides. I'm very grateful to all of you for, first of all, for organizing this, helping us organize this seminar, so from the EDRC, but also to everyone who's present. It's a tricky time of day. It's kind of late afternoon in Europe, so kind of cuts into children coming back from school or other home obligations, and we realize it's quite early in North America. It's kind of quite late in Asia. So we couldn't really find a time that would work for everyone, and we did want to make a global, something that would be a kind of a global discussion. So we hope this was a bit of a compromise that could kind of help accommodate most people's times, but the webinar will be recorded, so hopefully people can come back to this. So we're here today to talk about basically home energy injustices. And well, and many of you here I can see in the audience, and people who are presenting, we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers, people who are talking afterwards in this panel. So we've all been working in this field, and it's a field that's been basically growing in prominence within global agendas, within national agendas, partly because the issue of domestic energy deprivation, of energy hardship globally is just not really going away. So despite advancements, let's say in renewable energy or solar energy production, the expansion of that, despite even advancements in home energy efficiency, the issue of so many people struggling to access adequate energy services, to pay for energy services in the home, that's just not going away. And in many ways, that's because this is a problem that is a feature of the system that we live in, of this capitalist global political economy, which is actually reproducing those inequalities within it. So that's something that I think we try to highlight today, or this systemic nature of home energy injustices and how we need to start talking about them and thinking of them. So this webinar today is really a kind of reflection or development on a paper that a group of the participants, but also speakers in this session wrote. Some of them will be speaking today. It was recently published in Nature Energy. And for those of you who don't, because it's not unfortunately open access, but it's available on open access via Google Scholar. So you can access it there, or you can email us, you can contact us individually if you need a copy. And basically what we try to do in this perspective, in this paper, is to kind of take a step back, because there's so much work going on at the moment on these issues around what we might call energy poverty or home energy injustices. But because there's so much happening, some of the work and a lot of our discussions, we're all in our little silos doing our work, sometimes tend to reproduce the features of that system that is actually causing these injustices. So, and fundamentally, this boils down to questions, in our view, of how we talk about these problems, how we measure them, and who is involved in the conversation. So that's what that perspective is trying to do. Talk about questions of participation in reverse order, of data and language. And that's kind of the focus today. And hopefully it will get us all thinking about our own practice, but also about the wider context in which this work is done. Right, so talking about language, talking about data, measurement, and so on. And what someone might think, well, it doesn't really matter. Why are you sort of focusing on this? And are you not on the ground trying to solve these problems? Which, of course, a lot of us are. But in essence, at the core of this problem, at the start of the question, is how we think of this issue, and really how we describe it, how we talk about it. And these narratives about where and who we prescribe the causes of the problem, of the issue to, but also what the consequences are, they influence and inequalities in societies. They themselves shape the inequalities. They're not independent of them, but they also determine the horizons of what we do at an everyday basis, and also in the policy sphere. They also determine the horizons of the futures that we collectively imagine vis-a-vis these challenges. So one of the more salient aspects of this is the idea of who is deserving of assistance and who is not, by creating a narrative of where energy poverty or fuel poverty, I'm going to talk about the concepts in a minute, where all these things come from and what they actually result in. By creating a discourse around it, arguably, we then create a discourse about who can receive support, who needs to receive support, who is on the first line of the priorities that are around this, and who isn't. And then there's an additional issue here, which is all of this proliferation of large language models, of all kinds of other artificial intelligence approaches, which are basically taking up all of this language, all of these assumptions, all of these narratives, all of these debates, and putting them into a kind of system that reproduces those and reinforces in many ways those very same narratives. So in that sense, because, and we're seeing this more and more often, those very same algorithms are starting to be used as distributional tools. How we talk about injustice then has very serious effects on precisely the distribution, the allocation of support, the prioritization of government policy or other resources. Now, I'm one of the people who've talked about energy poverty my whole life. I basically had, I recall a discussion with my supervisor, Brenda Boardman, about more like 30 years ago when she was talking about fuel poverty. And then I was kind of saying, well, we need to talk about energy poverty because it's a term. At the moment, at the time, fuel poverty was more predominantly focused on as a discourse on kind of Great Britain, Ireland, partly Europe, some parts of Europe, but then energy poverty was, well, when it was energy poverty, it was primarily, you were talking about it in Africa, you were talking about it in parts of Asia, South America, and so on. And then basically, you would, at that point, there was that division. And I said, well, we need to talk about energy poverty because it's about everywhere in the world, because energy is really about this, what this is about. It's not necessarily fuel, it's about the energy services in the home. And now that term has really started to dominate the debate. And alongside it, there are other concepts to describe this issue of deprivation of hardship in the home. You have things like energy vulnerability, which I know a lot of the people in this virtual room have used. You have energy burden, which is predominantly used in the North American context, as well as the concept of energy insecurity. You have energy hardship, which is a very interesting, quite powerful, I would say also in many ways more adequate term, primarily used in the context of New Zealand, but also other countries. You have also got concepts like energy precarity, which some of my colleagues here at the University of Manchester have used and elsewhere. Again, a concept that captures that sort of political nature of these challenges. So you have a variety of terms to describe what we would argue are, at the sort of general level, kind of home energy injustices. So essentially injustices, so maldistributions, harms, effects of poor policies, so policy failures of basically unjust allocations or decisions and so on. So those effects then around energy being felt in the home, in the domestic or around the domestic sphere. That's why we use it as a kind of way of linking all of these terms together. Again, we can discuss this, whether it's the most adequate or whether one of these terms are the adequate or not. But the problem with all of this, right, we're using all of these terms and they are politically, culturally contingent, socially contingent, geographically contingent, and that's all great. But the way in which we use these terms often then has implications, and that's something that we've been trying to highlight. So, for example, energy poverty, again, being a very resonant term, sometimes we have this challenge because it has the term poverty. And yes, we are talking about a kind of poverty, but we're also talking about a broader issue with the energy system. We're talking about material deprivation. So sometimes we have this issue around energy poverty being sort of mixed up with income poverty and having to justify the distinction between the two. And then we also have the derivatives of these terms, which I think are more problematic. And we think, I'd say that's also highlighted in the perspective. So when people are referred to as being fuel poor or energy poor, when we are talking about diagnosing this problem or people suffering from, and I've personally done all of this, by the way, It's not that, and I'm not sort of, it's not like we are saying there isn't a history of using this for a whole range of reasons, and a lot of us have used these terms. But I think, again, needing to step back is very important. The term victims also, because in many ways, when we use this kind of language, particularly around the ascribing these sort of terms to particular people or groups, that individualizes the causes. So we're not talking about the systemic broader challenges, we're talking about someone being something. So we're ascribing, we're individualizing it, and that can lead to stigmatization. So again, in some ways, the perspective is a call for moving away from that kind of terminology, particularly that individualizing terminology, but also thinking about ways in which all of these concepts, we might start working, and again, we're not the first people to say this, we might start working towards a more unified global vocabulary. Why? Because we aren't able also to articulate global action if we can't, or develop global action if we can't we can't use a common language around all of this. So this last slide, I mean, it kind of has the things I said already. So home energy injustices are global. Everyone is experiencing them in different ways, obviously, for different reasons, but they are everywhere, and they are in many ways on the rise. Particularly in recent years, we have seen the global energy crisis has pushed more people into into challenges of hardship. And so our language, our narratives, our models need to point to the failures of our governance models, of our economic models to deliver justice at the domestic level. And that means also thinking about those analytical and measurement frameworks that are universal, that work across these geographical, social, political divides. Because while the drivers of injustice may be particular to particular regions, the experience of deprivation and injustice is universal. And the one other element of this, which we didn't really develop to a great extent in the paper, but something that we call for towards the end, is that if we are going to move in this direction, and if we argue we need to move in this direction, we have to think about ways of including all affected actors and groups in the process of deciding about this language, in the process of framing these narratives, and in the process of deciding about policies, measurements, and so on. So a lot of the times, all of the work in this sphere is expert-led, and that expert meaning the people who come in and tell others what to do. And that's a real challenge, I think, at the moment. The motto, and my colleague Carla Sedano brought this up, this idea of nothing about us without us, right? But we need to move it to nothing without us. We cannot talk about injustices without a broad process of inclusion, a broad process of engagement from the very outset. Okay, well, that's all I had to say for today. We have some excellent speakers in the panel to follow, and hopefully lots of room for conversation. I've just used this last slide also to thank in addition to EDRC, I'd like to thank the Just Centre at the University of Manchester, which is also supporting part of my time, the Joined Up Centre for Sustainability Transformations. And realizing that many of you are energy professionals working at the front line of energy injustice. I'm currently working on a project to understand the experiences of people who work to address energy injustices, and there is a survey at energystudies.net. So if some of you would like to it's a narrative survey, provide your input, I would be most grateful. So thank you for your time and for listening, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions and thoughts. Thanks.
Thanks, Stefan. So just to let you know that we are now going to have a panel discussion. So I'll introduce each of the panelists in turn. Stefan, if you could turn your camera off, that would be great. And just a reminder to participants to please put things into the Q&A and upvote them so that we can answer those questions once the panelists have had a time to talk. So our first panelist today is Harriet. If you could turn on your camera, please. So Professor Harriet Thompson is a professor of energy, sustainability and inequality at the University of Glasgow and associate director of the Glasgow Centre for Sustainable Energy. Her research interests broadly concern the role of public policy in shaping energy systems, structural inequalities in the distribution of housing, health and well-being outcomes and clean forms of energy, and energy poverty indicators. She is currently leading a major 5-year European Research Council-funded project called Energy Divides in Europe. Harriet, if you would like to speak.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction, Sarah. And thanks again for the invitation today. I think this perspective articles are a really welcome intervention. I think it's incredibly timely, given all of the kind of ongoing discussions around the impact of the recent kind of energy crisis that's still being felt in many countries, and the way in which just transition debates are kind of gaining more traction, and particularly in Europe as we sort of see the slightly messy introduction of the social climate plan and those implications there for energy poverty as well. I like that it's really reflective. I think it raises really important questions, as Stefan has just highlighted, around how the kind of language we use to talk about energy injustices or energy inequities actively shapes the kind of knowledge and policy responses to it. And I really appreciate the authors sort of acknowledging their own roles in kind of consolidating and indeed perpetuating some of these terms, and certainly of myself being guilty of perhaps at times talking about energy poor households or the energy poor. So I think that's really good, opening that ground there. And I think ultimately the kind of main benefit I take away from this article is really how these terms reinforce stigma and individualize what we know is ultimately a systemic set of problems. So today, I'd like to just open up 3 areas to kind of encourage further reflection and discussion. These are things that sort of came to me when I was reading it. So I guess the first one is sort of around multilingualism and sort of how these terms translate in sort of practice. So I find my theory has always been that energy poverty gained more traction in part over fuel poverty because it just naturally translated better. There's just a mechanical simplicity there of how it kind of translated to Spanish and so on, in a way that fuel poverty has been very specific to English speakers. So in that sense, I find kind of home energy injustices as a term perhaps is a little clunky, maybe doesn't neatly translate to other kind of European languages. And it just, in pure marketing terms, this has more words than the kind of energy poverty. So I think there's sort of question marks around how likely it is as a concept to kind of travel. But I really like the kind of the argument that, you know, we do need to reframe how we talk about energy poverty. And I think it's really important to highlight the author's call to use participatory methods, encouraging us to have those kind of broad kind of participatory approaches where we are co-constructing meaning and kind of coming up with concepts, definitions and methods together, and in a way that inherently includes people who are affected. So it isn't top down, as Stefan was highlighting. It's not just perpetuating this kind of expert view of the problem. So the second point I'd sort of flag would be around maybe the kind of political institutional dynamics. So as many people in this in the sort of attendee list I was skimming through will know quite well, in sort of European Union setting alone, it's taken more than 20 years of sustained advocacy to finally secure a legal definition of energy poverty in the kind of recast Energy Efficiency Directive in 2023. That was a really long, hard battle by a lot of people here today and more besides. So I think that really it makes that kind of disruptive reframing very difficult. And I think it's important that we sort of collectively reflect on then, in practical terms, how actually we can engage with bringing about less stigmatizing language in this context where stigmatizing terms are already, in some contexts, already quite heavily codified. And I guess the third point I'd touch on is sort of around activism and some of the alternative terms that's sort of been coming through through that area. So I think it's interesting to consider things like the right to energy. That seems like it's become a really popular kind of rallying term for activists, at least sort of within Europe, but also further afield. And that sort of makes me also think around some work that colleagues and I, including Carlos Dano, have been doing in Cuba, where kind of negative framings of problems using terms like poverty is just not something that where it tends to get avoided altogether. So there we kind of worked with the idea of energy solidarity. And I think all of these terms offer up different possibilities. So as Stefan was highlighting, with kind of energy precarity, they offer different entry points and or ability to kind of connect in different kinds of debates. So I think it's interesting thinking about rights to energy solidarity, and the way that links into energy communities, neoliberal alternatives, and kind of imagining different kinds of futures. But I recognise across them that they don't necessarily foreground the structural drivers. So that's where I think maybe putting that injustice element into it is quite interesting. So for me, I think this article is a really valuable provocation. Congratulate the authors on the work, and I think it opens up really valuable space for rethinking terminology. So thanks again.
Thanks, Harriet. Oops, I seem to have managed to press my button twice. There we go. Thanks very much. That's great. Next up is Professor Mari Martiskainen. If you could turn on your camera, Mari. Thank you very much. I'll just introduce you. So Professor Mari Martiskainen is the director of the Energy Demand Research Centre and a professor of energy and society at the University of Sussex. She is a social scientist with a specific interest in how we can transition energy, housing and transport systems to create a just and fair net zero society. Her research has focused on building energy efficiency policy, the intersections between fuel and transport poverty, the energy justice implications of low carbon pathways, the roles of users in low carbon transitions, and innovation in community energy. If you could speak for 5 minutes, please, Mari.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for attending today. It's really great to have you here. And thanks Stefan and Harriet for the initial remarks. So I am one of the authors on the paper, and I just really wanted to highlight one key aspect, and that to me is people. And I think it's really important to recognize that when we talk about energy injustices or home energy injustices, or the terminology like the right to energy, it's really important to think about that actually we are talking about people. And for me personally, when I've been doing research in this space, I've always found the kind of difference between actually talking to people who are perhaps struggling with their energy bills or having a cold home, and interviewing them and getting data from them for various different research projects, and then actually reading the policy documents or the academic papers where they talk about the fuel poor or they talk about the energy poor. And I find that there's a massive disconnect between what's actually happening on the ground with people and how policy and research often talk about them. So I really agree with what Stefan was saying about the importance of language, and particularly thinking about now with AI and the kind of system that we live in now, that anything that you put on the internet or in some space somewhere, an AI tool might take it up. So I think that's why it's really important to recognize that we are actually talking about people who have different lives and who have different circumstances. And policy often comes from this, and academics as well often can come from this sort of one size fits all approach, where we just say that, well, there are the fuel poor there. If we just fix them, that we will fix everything. But that's not really the case, because the energy system is complex. I certainly find it still very complex, even though I've been researching in this field for a long time, close to 20 years now. And, with the increases of AI, flexibility, different types of technologies, I think it's going to get even more complex for a lot of people. So I think the systemic issues that are underlying the way the system is run and operates are really important to be highlighted. So I'm really glad that we've done that with that paper as well. And one thing I wanted to sort of say as well is that even though, Stefan, you mentioned earlier that, these are not, that the solving energy issues or injustices is not an individual responsibility. And I agree with that. But I think it's still really, really important to recognize the stories that we can tell about people's circumstances. And I'm going to leave you with the story of John, who I interviewed a few years back. And he lives in a city in Scotland. He hadn't used his heating for about 6 years because it was just way too expensive for him. And despite all of the sort of hardship that he was facing with his energy use, he was definitely not vulnerable in the sense that we can sometimes think about people being vulnerable. He definitely didn't come across as hard to reach because he was very happy to take part in the research. And he was also very, very adamant that the system is the problem that he was facing the issues with, rather than kind of his individual circumstances that were very, very dire. So I just want to leave you with that as well, in a way that quite often we can sort of also talk about research participants in this sort of way that we think that, well, they need help, or they might be vulnerable, or they might be in a dire situation. And yes, often they are in that situation, but also I think some of the terminology can actually sort of victimize people too much, and I don't think that's a good idea either. So I agree with what Stefan was saying there earlier. Sarah, I will leave it at that because I'm really conscious with the time. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. If you can turn off your camera, and we'll get Tony to turn on his. And Tony, I will just find my notes and introduce you quickly. So Dr. Tony Reams is the Tishman Professor of Environmental Justice and an associate professor widely recognized for his scholarship and senior government leadership in environmental and energy justice. Tony founded the Urban Energy Justice Lab and the Energy Equity Project, and currently serves as the director of the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. His research focuses on advancing fair and equitable access to affordable, reliable, and clean energy, and examining the root causes and persistence of energy disparities across race, income, and geography. If you can go ahead, please, Tony.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank all of you for being here today. Thank you, Stefan, for inviting me to this, to be a part of this paper. It really came at a great time for me as I was re-entering the academy after serving 2.5 years in federal government here in the US, being the first ever Deputy Director of Energy Justice Policy and Analysis at the Department of Energy at the federal level. I love that Mari started or ended her remarks with a story, because that's really how I got into this work during the economic recession of 2008-09 here in the US and the global recession across the world, talking to folks about the challenges and opportunities that we had to take government resources and really bring about kind of that triple bottom line, focusing on the economy, the environment, and some of the social equity issues that particularly urban areas in the US were facing. We put massive amount of money into our low-income energy efficiency program, known as the Weatherization Assistance Program, which allowed us to basically address this issue of energy poverty. I had never heard of energy poverty as a PhD student, but started hearing about fuel poverty and energy poverty from many of you in the EU and UK. And so I came from an environmental justice background, trying to apply the principles of environmental justice to what we were doing to address climate change and energy. And it was the stories of those individuals who were experiencing energy unaffordability, who had inefficient homes, who were too hot and too cold, that really allowed me to see that this wasn't just individual issues, but there was a throughput through all of the stories and the homes that I visited that alerted me to the fact that this was a broader social issue. And so trying to frame all of that under the concept of energy justice, I think, is why this terminology makes sense as a container for the kind of multifaceted challenges that households face either trying to afford energy, trying to access clean energy. We haven't talked yet about the kind of disparities in accessing the energy or participating in the energy transition, as well as broader workforce. And so 3 things that stood out to me as we were working on this paper is the data to actually understand these issues, address them. And some of that is our qualitative, but also our quantitative data. In the US, we've been measuring energy and security for several decades, but it wasn't until 2015 that we really started to look at it across households. We were really focused just on the extreme low-income households who got government assistance. But what we ended up finding was that across 3 areas, the inability to pay energy, people who forego basic necessities, or who live with unhealthy indoor temperatures, those numbers have been increasing through the pandemic, starting to come down when there is a government focus on new resources going into communities. But here in the US, now we're in a moment where those resources are under attack and may actually go away, in an era where our government may also try to hide data. And so I think raising this issue of the injustices allows us to connect it to both policy decisions, but also opportunities for advocacy, which is one of the things I hope that this paper can lead to. And then, the opportunity window we had during the Biden administration was to really use the term energy justice in ways that it hadn't been before, to kind of elevate energy issues under some social injustices or the recognition of social injustices, and then using the levers of government to actually address that. And so I think what the paper allows us to do, particularly in this moment of political unrest in several countries, is that it gives academics, advocates, and households experiencing energy injustices an opportunity to raise the conversation, to chat about what they're experiencing, to talk about potential policies and how they have worked. Are they still working for the current environment that we're in? And then create the new research agenda where we co-develop and co-create opportunities to understand these issues and then to address them in ways that meet the current moment. And so I'm super excited to both teach this paper in my class in a couple weeks, but also have conversation with folks across the globe who are studying these issues, who are experiencing these issues, and who are creating the policies to address them. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tony. Just to mention that we have no questions yet, so please do put your questions in the question and answer section and vote up questions that you like the look of. Otherwise, we're just going to have to make up our own questions and you won't be able to hold us to account. So you've been warned, please do add your questions. Last but not least, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Carla Sedano Vidavicencio. Carla, if you could turn on your camera. She is a multidisciplinary academic and leader in the field of energy and social sciences, innovation, and sustainability with a gender perspective. She holds a doctorate in engineering and applied sciences and has further graduate studies in genomic medicine and computer sciences. She was president of the National Association of Solar Energy in Mexico, and she's the secretary and a full associate of Morelos Academy of Social Sciences and Humanities. She is now head of strategic innovation at the Institute of Renewable Energies at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. If you could go ahead and give us your reflections, please.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, I would like to, first of all, thank everybody for sharing all the experience that was working with this paper and also reading it, as Harry said. And I would like to start saying about the process of getting to this display of different points of view on and this provocation that Harriet commented, because it was a provocation, the invitation from Stefan to their team and the way we will work together. So I have to recognize, as the Mexican in the group, that this was a very inclusive process. It was congruent with what we're saying in the paper, the idea of getting everybody involved in the conversation. It was brave because we all had to recognize our privilege, and that's not an easy task. But also it was a very difficult process because with all these strong voices, the sharing ideas, it was a compromise between what everybody was thinking about, what we have already been working on. And I have only been in this field from 5 years, 6 years from now. So it was like a very challenging endeavor, but I do think that we learned from doing it. We were able also to be inclusive, not only between us, but also to the voices that were not part of this paper. And also I have to recognize, for example, Carla Recalde, who was always critical on different engineering views that I had from the world, and that helped me to shape these more inclusive, socially centered views, which in due time, went and were part of these conversations to this paper that Stefan led. Also, I liked a lot what Harriet said about this provocation again, and the way that it's a challenge. It's not the final word, the paper, as we also state in the piece. It's the start of a conversation, of a reflection on what we need to do as scholars and practitioners. So it's great to have these contradictions, this discussion, because it infuses life to the term and to the topic, and it is very much needed. And I think that one of the most pressing issues that I have in my mind is it was from moving from being the conversation, the energy poor, as we used to say them, or we used to talk about the communities, to be part of the conversation. But I think that it's about being the conversers. We need that the persons be the ones that put the ideas there. So I think that moves a lot how we do our research, our practices, our policy. And it's revolutionary as the times are asking for. So I think that as an engineer, it also, I do have to acknowledge that there are other movements moving to the transdisciplinarity of our disciplines, working around how to include more voices and how to stop having this technical, medical, kind of clinical point of view on topics in general, and to regain the basis of what engineering is about, which is the reflection that is most important for my institute and my colleagues, is to remember that engineering has to go to be socially centered, socially driven, and socially evaluated and assessed. So when we get to that point, then participatory, then non-capitalistic ways, then we find different non-vertical spaces to have this conversation and to make the society, the people, the communities, not only the center, be embedded in the conversations. And it's like trying to find this quantic space to be and not to be everywhere, and to understand from those empathic point of views. Stoney was also reflecting on different difficult times that we have been living on. How do we have to challenge those views, those patriarchal views of the world, and those very post-truth realities? We have to challenge them from the academia and from the practitioner side. And it is about people again. Mari said it very clearly. This is about people, and we have to center the practice and the research on the people and on reflecting with them, never without them. And finally, just a final remark, I always reflect about energy transitions as a plural, because there's not one transition. It is a diversity of transitions. They have to be just, they have to be sustainable. Most importantly, they have to be inclusive, or there won't be energy transitions, and that would be a terrible thing to happen. So for more inclusivity, more sustainability, and more justice, we do need to engage coherently and congruently with all the persons that participate in the process. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Carla. If everyone in the panel and you, Stefan, could turn on your cameras and your microphones. And we do have some questions, I'm very happy to say. So I think I'm going to just, there have been upvoted a little bit, so I'm going to just go in order. So the first question is about the tendency these days in different countries to move, or the movement towards more stigmatizing language and discrimination, particularly directed towards migrants and racialized minorities. So I wonder if the panel would like to offer their thoughts on the implications of this wider language on everyday experience of home energy injustices, and does it make it even more important for us to use inclusive language and framings in our work? Mari, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is where the basically talking about people really makes a difference. You know, all the terms like migrants, racialized minorities, they tend to just block people into one block. But I think it's really important that we talk about people. So I'll just leave it at that because I'm really conscious of the time. So I would like to move away actually from a lot of these kind of blocks of, you know, putting people into boxes according to certain characteristics, even though I do know that policy kind of prefers that. But yeah, let's talk about people.
Yeah.
Anybody else would like to comment on this question? Tony.
I'll jump in real quick just because we're experiencing this in real time. The current president of the US issued a list of words that are primarily banned. So energy justice, environmental justice are some of the words. But there's a major attack on folks who are racialized minorities and migrants. And so I think in the advocacy or activist space that some of us kind of coexist, the use of those words, to continue to use those words to recognize people who are disadvantaged, who are taken advantage of, is super critical in this moment. And so I think to continue to push that we talk about justice as a recognition that we live in an unjust world. And if we back off of it and use other words, I think that allows us to hide the real issues that we're experiencing and then not lead to solutions.
Indeed, perhaps it's a good reason to keep coming up with new terms so that they can't be banned quick enough. But does anybody else have a comment here at all before we go on to the next question? I mean, it's quite closely related, so I'll just go on to it. How do you suggest that participatory definitions can come to the fore while at the same time creating a globally recognized term or language? The questioner has suggested that perhaps it's a sort of central tension. You're kind of smiling, Stefan, as if you might have a thought about that.
I'm just thinking about the instances in which any of the international institutions working in this space, I'm talking about people like the World Bank or the United Nations or the International Energy Agency, but even like the IPCC, right? Have they ever tried to develop participatory language? Do we know any examples where an institution working at the global scale has tried any kind of exercise? You know, I didn't write this in, it wasn't in the paper, but we can have that conversation here, right? Nobody has even tried it. I think if we tried it, we might find that there's more convergence than we think. That's my experience, having worked in a range of contexts. I don't negate the fact that there will be, of course, I think it's a very important point. There is a tension there between universality and particularity. But the point I'm trying to make is a slightly adjacent one, which is no one's actually doing it at the moment. And we have to stop with this practice of the experts deciding what something is going to be called or how things are going to be ascribed or how processes will be defined or analyzed. And we have to think about how we might start working in this in a completely different way with the actual people who we're engaging with.
Mari, you had your hand up and put it down again. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks, Stefan. I was in one international workshop earlier this year, and people were particularly talking about widening participation in clean energy, and terminology like what we've discussed today came up quite a lot. And I raised the question of language in that meeting. And by the way, Tony, I didn't mean to earlier say that racialized minorities shouldn't be used those terminologies at all. So in case that came across like that, but yeah, so But even in that workshop, a lot of the people were talking about, it was kind of experts in the room, and there were some representatives from sort of organizations that work with NGOs and charities that work closely with people in participatory processes, but still the language in that room wasn't very inclusive. So I made some comments.
Carla, go ahead.
Yeah, I do think that also the trying to understand this tension. And as you said, moving from the particularities to the generalities, we are in a generation that can do it because we have the resources to do it. Back in the day, there were not the information technologies, the capacity to be in this type of talks. It was impossible. But now we have the resources. Technology has put us in a place where we should be able to work with these extremes with it's not so difficult to be able to embrace it. The issue is that there has to be a will to do it and the time sensitiveness to do it because it's not so fast. It's not the easy wording. It's not the easy work. It takes time. But I do think that more than ever, we need to take those times to do it the best way possible. And in the sense of the public policy, in Mexico, there is an attempt to move from cost-benefit analysis to, we call them shared prosperity analysis, whatever that means. But it's like, let's see how it works. However, we need a lot of time to try to test those new ways of looking at things, in particular at energy justice, for example. But I think that we have the resources, so we live interesting times.
Indeed, we do. Just a reminder to put your hand down, otherwise I'll keep coming back to you. Yes, I'm going to just go around the panel now and ask you what you think the key takeaway message is from all of this. Somebody's asked this question. Harry, do you mind?
Yeah, I can jump in. Well, I'm not an author on the paper, but I think my takeaway from it really is the need to have more care around how we're talking about these problems. And I think in general, we need a more careful kind of approach to research. So I think, I really like the provocation of rethinking language. And I think it's a really good moment when there's so many other connecting debates that we could draw together and have a more kind of inclusive look at all of these different expressions of injustice across the energy system.
Who wants to go next? Anyone ready? Key takeaways. Carla.
I'll chip in. I think let's walk the talk. Let's really engage the practice where we criticize our particular life, our government's public policy. And being congruent is hard, but let's do it. I think it's a call for let's do it in our practice. This self-reflectness and critique must be an everyday issue. So for me, that's the most important message I can give.
Thank you. Anybody else want to have a go?
Yeah, I can have a go. I have talked about people already several times. So can I say two things? People, which I've said multiple times, but also a lot of these issues have persisted for a very long time. So we need to do something different. The system needs to change. Something radical needs to change because it seems, particularly in the UK, that there is kind of this silent acceptance that we just have 10% of the people in England. In some cases, it's maybe up to 40% in some of the other devolved nations like Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland particularly, people who are really not having sufficient energy services at home. So why is that? Why do we accept this sort of almost status quo on this? And there's a whole host of us as researchers who research this space. And I sometimes have that as a personal dilemma in a way that this injustice is paying for some of the work that we are doing. But clearly it's a systemic issue. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Can I follow up on Mari's point really quick? I love that you mentioned the kind of acceptance of the fact that there are going to be people that don't have energy. And I think that is kind of what the energy poverty term has allowed, right? Is that, globally, we have not solved the issue of poverty. And so it should be expected that people will experience energy poverty. And so with that in mind, the solutions seem far-fetched and unattainable. But I think the home energy injustices puts it in a frame that, at least a normative frame, that this should not be occurring. And it allows us to say that we should do something about this. And now let's think about why it exists and what are the avenues for solutions. And so that is why the justice framing kind of sticks with me and is my main takeaway is that we really have to look at this as a systemic issue that can be addressed systematically, efficiently, effectively through policy and advocacy and support for people.
And if I may add to that, I think, and this is something that's really echoing, I think, what everyone's saying here, because what I think we're trying to do is sort of stop this normalization machine that capitalism is so good at. And that's trying to normalize, if we're looking at what's happening in other spheres of life, it's constantly an effort of normalizing other types of injustice. And then, through just moving that sort of frame of what's acceptable to say and what's acceptable to do bit by bit every single day. And I think I think this is what we've really tried to, and I didn't even think of articulating it that way before this conversation and all the fantastic questions we got, which sadly we've not been able to answer them all, but obviously, hopefully we can have this conversation later on. It's just to stop the normalization. So even for me, someone who thought it's so great that we're talking about 30 years ago, I said it's fantastic that we're talking about energy poverty. Today, I kind of worry about the fact that it's become so normalized and a lot of the approaches around it. So I'm uncomfortable. Someone asked about the indicators that are being used, and I'm thinking, actually, those have become normalized and we kind of treat them, they've been banalized almost. And so, we keep coming up with new indicators and, there's this whole process of just adjusting and accepting this fact. And I think that's where the problem lies. So, yeah, so I guess we try to shake things up a little bit, but to go back to Kyla, that shake-up needs to start translating into our everyday practice and constantly trying to shake up the roots of the system that's kind of driving all of this.
Great, thank you. So I was hoping to ask another question, but we've run out of time, I think. So I think what we'll do is we'll try and answer these questions and send out answers to them in the email that we send with the slides within the next few days. We're also going to be, as I said, putting the recording of this session up on our YouTube channel. So without further ado, I will thank everybody for attending the session today. Thank the speakers for their invaluable contributions and the authors for writing the paper in the first place. And most of all, thank you very much to my colleagues for helping us to set this webinar up and for putting it on the website and doing all those technical things that terrify me. Thank you very much to everybody else.